Hi, we are now reaching the third block of Module 3, Intraday and Balancing Markets. This third block will look into the balancing market itself and imbalance definition. Looking back at the electricity market timeline, we remember that there are two sides of it. On one side, the market operator, and on the other side, the system operator. This is just another way to represent it. In the previous module, we've looked at the dead market or the spot market, which is called S-spot for the Nord Pool in Scandinavia. In the previous block of this module, we have looked at the intraday market, as for example the LBAS for the Nord Pool in Scandinavia. So this is for the market operator side. Now we are passing the ball to the system operator, which during the hour operation is operating this balancing market, which is going to be used to keep the system in balance between supply and demand. This is since the system operator has the ultimate responsibility to keep the transmission system in balance. For instance, in Denmark, Energinet is the system operator and has responsibility over the transmission grid at the highest voltage level, 400 kV, and the regional electricity transmission grid with 132 kV on the east side of Denmark and 150 kV on the west side of Denmark. What we call the balancing stage actually combines two mechanisms, though we eventually see it as a single market mechanism. There is the regulation market side, where the TSO is obtaining the necessary regulating power prior to the delivery hour. And then during the hour, with the balancing market, we look at the real-time operation, we settle imbalances, and we use actual metering for that. Note that for the regulation market, this actually links to some of the ancillary services, which we will discuss in the next module of this course. So who participates in these markets? On the regulation market side, there are those who are willing to help the system. So they are declaring to the system operator they are ready to change their set point, either on the consumption or on the production side, eventually to start a unit or stop a unit in order to help the system if there is some imbalances to manage. In Scandinavia, one of the specifics that we have is that all those resources, these regulation resources, are on the so-called NOIS list, NOIS for Nordic Operational Information System. And this means that in the whole region, we actually share the regulation resources and obviously subject to availability in transmission capacity, the system operator in Denmark may actually purchase or use regulation resources from the neighboring countries. On the balancing market side, the participants are actually those who are inducing imbalances in the system. So they are those who are not respecting their original schedule. And for this difference in schedule, there's going to be a settlement process where this participant will eventually have to pay for the difference between the scheduled energy production or consumption and the actual production or consumption. But what is an imbalance? There might be imbalances at two levels. Obviously, we have to think of the overall system level, and at the overall system level, based on the overall supply that was scheduled and the overall demand that was scheduled, they should be equal. There might be eventually more supply than demand because there's a change in the schedule of some of the suppliers or some of the consumer. And if supply is greater than demand, we talk about positive imbalances and there's a need for downward regulation. At the opposite, if supply is less than demand, we will need upward regulation and we talk about negative imbalances. Finally, if still close to real-time supply equal demand, so we follow the schedule or there's been changes in schedule but still we manage to keep this balance, there is no need for regulation and we are in a no imbalance situation. Note that this sign here is approximative, we don't say strictly equal. This is since the minimum bit size in this market is actually quite big. It's in the order of megawatts. So when the imbalances are less than this minimum bit size, we actually consider that the system is in balance. So we have talked about an imbalance at the system level. But obviously an imbalance at the system level is the result of a combination of imbalances at the participant level. For all those that are scheduled for production and consumption, we need to check what they are really producing. Is it in line with what they are scheduled for? Let's look at the supply side as an example. If on the supply side, actual generation is more than scheduled generation, you have a positive imbalance. It's the opposite on the consumption side. If actual generation is less than scheduled generation, then we have a negative imbalance. Again, it's the opposite on the consumption side. And if the market participant on the supply side or on the consumption side respect its schedule, we talk about no imbalance. And then eventually there shouldn't be a settlement for that. Let's give a few examples so as to illustrate how this works. Remember our direct market clearing from the previous module? We have a few of the offers that were fully accepted and then scheduled. So we have the schedule from G1 to G7 in megawatt hour here, and the last offer of G8 was partially accepted at the level of 55 megawatt hour. On the demand side, D1 to D9 were fully scheduled, and these were the amounts they were supposed to consume for the hour of interest. I say they were supposed to supply and to consume, since there might actually be a difference between what the schedule was and what is actually happening. Especially here, if G1 is a wind farm or wind power producer generally, there might be some differences simply due to forecast errors. We had G1, looking at the supply side, we had G1 with a schedule of 120 megawatt hours, then we had G2, G3, etc. until G8 with 55 megawatt hour. So the total supply as cleared by the market reached 995 megawatt hours, and obviously the consumption side is also for a total of 995 megawatt hours. But if we are in this situation where the actual delivery of G1 is 100 megawatt hours, we talk of a negative imbalance for G1. All the others here, if respecting their schedule, you see they keep the color blue, they are in no imbalance situation. What is the result for the system? For the system overall, there is 20 megawatt hours less coming from G1, so overall we have 20 megawatt hours less for the system. So the system is also in negative imbalance. Another situation on the positive side, we revisit this case where we had the original schedule, G1 to G8, for a total of 995 megawatt hours. Now, possibly due to a forecast error, but on the other side, G1 is actually producing 140 megawatt hours. This is then a positive imbalance for this market participant. Assuming that all the other supply side market participants and consumption side market participants have no imbalance, the result for the system is that we have a total now of 1,015 megawatt hours. This is a positive imbalance compared to the original schedule. Let's now combine things a little bit. Based on this original schedule, we could imagine that, let's say, G2 to G7 have no imbalance. Nothing has changed. But for G1, again, due to a forecasting error for the wind farm, we reach an actual delivery of 140 megawatt hours. So G1 is again in a positive imbalance situation. For the last unit schedule, G8, the schedule originally was of 55 megawatt hour, but actually G8 is delivering 45 megawatt hours. So G8 is in a negative imbalance situation as a market participant. When we combine all these actual outcomes, the overall system situation is that we have 1,005 megawatt hours of supply for a planned consumption of 995 megawatt hours. So again, we have a positive imbalance for the system as a whole. Now, I would like to invite you to use the self-assessment quiz to check your understanding.